So good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Weinzman, and I'm the director of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to welcome you to our program this evening, which is the last in the series entitled Jews in the America to Come. Since this is our final gathering in this series, it seems like a good time for me to acknowledge that the inspiration for the program came from a famous poem by Langston Hughes that many of us have been thinking about during this last year, a poem called Let America Be America Again, which was originally published in 1936. For those of you not familiar with the poem, it includes the words which inspired the title for this series. Let America be America again, he wrote, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. This series was born of the recognition that America is not yet America. It is not yet the land of the free that it was meant to be. But it was also born of the hope that such an America may yet arrive. The question we've been focused on in this series is how Jews fit into this journey from where we are now to the America to come. And that brings us to the focus of tonight's program on Black-Jewish relations, both then and now, in the era of the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s and 70s and in the present moment. Many American Jews are proud of the role of Jews in the Civil Rights Movement, but the heyday of that movement was more than half a century ago, and the decades since have shown in many ways that the struggle for equality and racial justice has yet to fully succeed. For the last few years, even before the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others this summer, Black Lives Matter movement and other groups have been trying to shake white America out of its complacency by calling attention to the systemic racism and inequality that persist in law enforcement, healthcare, education, housing, and in other areas of life. There is much more work to be done, and tonight our goal is to encourage reflection on where Jews fit into this continuing struggle. To lead us in this reflection, I've turned to a dear colleague, Dr. Anthea Butler, scholar of religious studies and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania and chair of my home department, the Religious Studies Department. But before I introduce her to you, I want to say a few words about the format of our program and to add a few words of thanks. This program will be about an hour in length. It will begin with remarks by Professor Butler for about 20 to 30 minutes, and we'll use the rest of the time for discussion. When you have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions in writing. And those will be read by us behind the scenes. And then when Professor Butler is done with her remarks, I will appear back on the screen alongside Dr. Ann Albert, the Director of Public Programs for the Katz Center, and we will moderate the discussion by reading your questions on your behalf. Let me also add a huge thank you to the staff of the Katz Center who have made this whole series possible. This includes Diana Dennis Walters, our events coordinator and the kind of puppet master behind the scenes of the screen you're viewing now. Ann Albert, who I mentioned previously, who's been a fantastic moderator. Brian Lipscomb, who is our technology guru, and Becky Friedman, who is our communications coordinator and has helped us to be in touch with you and spread the word about this program. So with that, let me now introduce our speaker this evening. Professor Butler's research and writing encompasses African American religion and history, race, politics, evangelism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. Among her publications are the book Woman in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and a new book entitled White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, which is due out in the spring of this coming year, 2021. Professor Butler is widely esteemed by her colleagues in the field of religious studies, as was reflected in her election as the next president of the American Society of Church History, which is one of many honors she has received. And her influence goes well beyond academia because of her savvy use of both conventional media and social media as tools of scholarly communication. You may have seen her as a commentator on CNN, BBC, MSNBC, or you might have read her in venues like the Washington Post. And you can certainly follow her on her very popular Twitter account. I feel great personal appreciation and affection for Dr. Butler as her colleague, and I'm very grateful to her now for sharing her insights with us. Thank you, Dr. Butler.
Thank you, Professor Weinzman, and thank you all for being here this evening. It's a great honor, and I'm really excited about tonight's talk. Not excited in a way that I would say I'm happy about it, because what it means to me is something of a shared past and maybe a hopeful future, but how we go about that is probably going to be a big question for all of us. So I'm grateful to the Katz Center for having me tonight and for all of you joining me this evening. I know that times are really interesting and tough, but every time you listen to something like this, I think it's really useful. I want to start off first by talking about why this subject is very interesting and dear to my heart. Part of it is about I teach the history of Afghan religious history, and I also teach American religious history here at Penn. And one of the things that has always puzzled me and troubled me at the same time is I have a very popular class that I teach that used to be called Martin and Malcolm in America, which was basically about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But I renamed back in 2017 from Religion and Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter, because I realized that there was a continuation, a conversation that needed to be had. And so in thinking about that, one of the things that became very clear to me was a broken relationship, a relationship that I wouldn't necessarily say had been broken, but has not been tended to. And that relationship between Jews and African Americans and the quest for civil rights and to push back against the foes of hatred in this country has suffered some disrepair. And part of that disrepair comes from, I would say, to put it in a very interesting way, are both cares about our nationalistic interest. First for Jews, for the nation of Israel and the state of Israel, for African Americans, for the state of the Black people in America, and also how they are treated around the world. And so I would say our interest in our own nationalisms has caused us to lose part of what we have had as a shared concern about racism and injustice in America. And so tonight, what I want to do is take you through just a little bit of civil rights history. I'm not going to hit upon all the luminaries that I could that were Jewish, that were involved in the civil rights movement, but I just want to give you a flavor of that. So that's the first part of my talk. The second part of my talk is going to be about what I think went wrong. And I'm going to point out several things that I think on both sides that probably have affected this relationship. And then the third piece, which will be the last piece, is going to be about Black Lives Matter, Jews, and how we go forward in this particular moment with the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of all kinds of racial violence in America. So I'm going to be showing you a few screens tonight, but first I want to start off with a story about 1958 and 1958 in Miami Beach. And that story begins with Martin Luther King's appearance at the American Jewish Congress. The speech that he would give at the American Jewish Congress in Miami was one that was actually sort of a replacement speech, because he had turned down a speaking engagement with the organization before, but then he was urged by his friend to do this speech because essentially, his friend Stanley Levinson, because essentially he said, this is one of the few organizations which is holding a convention in the South and wants to bring the issue of integration forward. So King did this speech. And so I want to use a quote from the speech to start to talk about the ways in which Jews in the civil rights movement and African Americans banded together to fight for the rights of African Americans, but also in a way, the rights of Jews as well, because as you well know, these rights were also being clipped in certain kinds of ways in areas across the United States. King's address to the National Biennial Convention of the American Jewish Congress had this quote in it: "Every Negro leader is keenly aware, from direct and personal experience, that the segregationists make no fine distinctions between the Negro and the Jew. The irrational hatred motivating his actions is readily turned against Catholic, Jew, Quaker, liberal, and one-worlder as it is against the Negro. Some have jeered at Jews with Negroes, some have bombed the homes and churches of Negroes, and in recent acts of inhuman barbarity, some have bombed your synagogues, indeed right here in Florida. Have the Nazis murdered Catholic, Poles, and Jews, Protestant, Norwegian, and Jews? The races of America fly blindly at both of us, caring not at all which one of us falls. Their aim is to maintain through cruel segregation groups who use as scapegoats to facilitate their political and social rule over all people. Our common fight is against these deadly enemies of democracy. And our glory is that when we are chosen to prove that courage is a characteristic of oppressed people, however cynically and brutally they are denied full equality and freedom. When you see things about the civil rights movement, we often don't talk about this relationship between African Americans and Jews. But while Black churches were going through some of the bombings and everything else that we see as normal kinds of vignettes about the civil rights movement, whether you've watched Eyes on the Prize and others, these same things were happening to Jews, especially in the South. And so what I want to do right now is I'm going to share my screen and show you a PowerPoint, which I'm going to kind of talk through a little bit and then stop so I can talk about the middle piece, okay? So soon after the speech that happened in Miami of Martin Luther King's, there was a bombing of the Atlanta Temple in October 1958. You can see that picture to your right, probably. It's the bombing of the temple in Atlanta, which was home of the Hebrew Benevolent Society established in 1860. And Rabbi Rothschild at the time was the rabbi. And now I'm going to play for you Mayor Hartfield's quote and political broadcast that he did on the news that night. And hopefully you'll be able to hear this. So turn up your volume just a little bit if you have it down. This is an old clip.
Atlanta has always been a lighthouse of racial and religious tolerance in the South. And we are shocked and amazed that this awful thing could happen in our midst. And we prefer to believe that it is a work of people outside of our city. We have brought every resource of law enforcement to bear. We have offered rewards, and we hope that the perpetrators of this thing will be apprehended. But my friends, here you see the end result of bigotry and intolerance. And whether they like it or not, those who practice rabble-rousing and demagoguery are the godfathers of the cross burners and the dynamite.
Well, actually, these were the cross burners who did this. And this was a series of attacks against synagogues in the South during 1957 and 1958. So if you look at this here, I can show you, this is from Emory University, Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library, from The Bomb That Healed, from Rabbi Rothschild's book. You can see throughout the South where there were bombings. We have a couple in North Carolina, the bombing in Miami, Florida, right before King spoke. You had Nashville, Tennessee, 1958, Jacksonville, Florida, which is number 5, Synagogue and Jewish Community Center bombed. Birmingham bombing, 1958. This bombing for Birmingham is like a really big thing. And we always think about the 1963 bombing with the 4 little girls, but there's a reason why Birmingham is called Bombingham. Atlanta, which was a temple that's bombed in October of 1958, which I just showed you, and Peoria, Illinois, which is kind of the outlier up here in 1958. These acts of violence that happen against Jewish synagogues and all of this is just one in a long piece of the kind of violence that happened during the civil rights movement, of bombings, church burnings, synagogue burnings, all kinds of things that were happening. And so the effects on this was to have many people who were in the Jewish community decide to get involved in the civil rights movement, not simply because it was the right thing to do, but because this was an existential threat against their own communities. And so one of the bigger events that happened to end up doing this was the Jewish Freedom Riders in the summer of 1961. Freedom rides were started from the Congress of Racial Equality because this was a way to start to integrate buses, interstate buses that were going down to the South. And we had students and others, rabbis, and all sorts of people who decided to take those buses. And there's a really great piece, and if anybody wants this, I can forward this to the Katz Center, and one of the books that actually lists all of the people who did freedom rides, and you can also find all the Jewish members of freedom rides. But I should take a step back for a moment and say this, because this is really important to what this conversation is really about underneath. Not only is this about people being involved in the civil rights movement because of them wanting to push forward things, this is also about interfaith relationships. We don't use that word very much. We tend to think of it as interreligious cooperation now, or ecumenical things when we talk about that being between Christians. But interfaith cooperation is really an important part of the civil rights movement, because what you had were Muslims, Christians, and Jews coming together to try to move things forward in the nation, try to move things towards equality, towards integration, towards this leaving behind Jim Crow. So you can see the first picture over here, from Florida restaurant closed to Clarence, they sit in. This was a group of 10 clergymen, freedom riders that came in, 2 rabbis and 8 ministers. One of the rabbis who came in was Walter Plaut, who ended up passing away probably a year or two after this. And so let me just give a quote about this. The role of religious community was incredibly important in freedom rides. It can't be overemphasized enough. Not all were rabbis. Some were college students, some were rabbis, and some were just activists and intellectuals. It was a coming together of all of these groups. So you had different people who were involved in this. And this is from Joshua Platt's archives, actually, of what happened to them when they went down on a freedom ride and decided to try to integrate and sit in a restaurant, and how they were taken away. The pictures that you see over here of 3 young Jewish women who were freedom riders, Georgia Siegel-Bordowski, Judith Fries, and Mimi Feingold Riel, were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi when they took a freedom ride from Nashville to Jackson, Mississippi. People were arrested during these freedom rides. This was the first way in order to try to push people to integrate the interstate bus system, which many people were using during this time period. When Rabbi Plaut went back to his congregation in New York, they really, there was a very big split about how to treat him. He had a divided congregation because they were upset with him for being involved in freedom rides. He said that he told the press, within the foreseeable future, this problem, segregation, will be virtually non-existent. He would end up dying 3 years later, in January 3rd, 1964, before the Civil Rights Act happened, because he had already been ill at the time that he joined the freedom rides. So this is an important piece of what begins to happen. And if we think about the later kinds of things in 1964 and others, where students went down, and of course, the unfortunate murder of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman in 1964 and in summer of 1964, during that freedom vote movement. This was a terrible thing. People were putting their lives on the line to do this. The next slide I want to show you is from actually the March on Washington in 1963. And I know that normally we think about showing Rabbi Heschel during these things, but I wanted to show Rabbi Joachim Prince and give you a little taste of his speech at the March on Washington in 1963 as a template for thinking about how things were going at that particular time. I won't play the whole thing, but you can hear it.
As an American Jew, as Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to the great demonstrations in which thousands of us proudly participate, a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say, our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. It is not merely sympathy and compassion for the Black people of America that motivates us. It is, above all, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born of our own painful historic experience.
I think that's a good place to stop, because this idea that our shared experience of slavery, fighting for freedom, is this binding experience. And I think one of the things that was so important about this speech was to put that in perspective, but also the call for democracy to be given to African Americans, to Jews, to everyone there, and to also mention this whole situation of the Holocaust and other things that were happening to Jews in the world during this time period. Obviously, many of you know that this is before the '67 war. Israel has been started as a nation, but there's still a fight. There's still the memories of the things that have happened in the Holocaust. And so bringing that into the milieu of what is happening in America during this time period was an important piece for Rabbi Prince to bring up during that time period. Of course, there was 1964 and what happened to Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman and others. But 1965, Selma to Montgomery March was also a very important piece of all of this. And you see this picture on the left with Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Maurice Ainsworth, and Abraham Joshua Heschel during the march from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. This is probably the seminal moment that people most remember. But the picture on the left, on your right, probably, I think, for me, is this more important picture where you have the Jewish young man picking up one of the people who had been beaten at this Edmund Pettus Bridge. This was a picture that really resonated across the country. And so we talk more about what happened to John Lewis in the African-American community. But I think this picture, to me, gives the kind of solidarity that I think existed for many during this Selma to Montgomery March and what had happened with Jews and African Americans in the civil rights movement. That was a very important piece of that. Let me go forward to just clip a couple of other pictures. You have a picture over here. This is right before Martin Luther King is assassinated, where Martin Luther King, they're protesting the Vietnam War at Arlington National Cemetery in '68. And Abraham Heschel, of course, is here in the middle. You can see the Torah being held on the side, the scrolls being held on the side. This is an important piece because this is moving not just from racism, but to actually go against the Vietnam War, which is another piece of this kind of push in the civil rights movement. We often don't think of King and as being the person who is pushing against the war, but it is actually post-1965 and the signing of the Civil Rights Act and all of this, where he begins to push back against the war and against also poverty. And so it was not just a sense in which this was about segregation and moving into integration and getting rid of all these laws. It was also about other injustices that are happening in the country at the time period. And Jewish involvement in that is really important. Post the assassination of Martin Luther King, I included the 1969 Freedom Seder by Rabbi Arthur Waskow. I had the pleasure of being with Rabbi Waskow a couple of years ago on a panel, and I've also been to his new sort of version of the Seder at his home. And the Seder was really important because it was the first Haggadah that really challenged the ways in which you think traditionally about Passover. And one of the things that Waskow said about it was this: Seders would be best carried out on the steps of the White House or the corridors of the Pentagon. Let us indeed celebrate the first night of Passover as families of blood or free communal choice. But on the second night, let us face the pharaohs. This idea of the Freedom Seder that happened in DC during that time period was really important in terms of making sort of an opening space to begin to use the kinds of practices that everyone knew, Seders and others, to bring ideas about civil rights and other things into this idea about how can we make justice? How can Jews be available for justice? So I want to stop the PowerPoint for a minute and talk and give you sort of a brief overview about what I think happens from this point, because that's actually an important piece. And then I'm going to come lastly to the issue of Black Lives Matter and Jews and the kinds of things we face now in the 21st century. Post-civil rights movement, I talk about the African-American community in a piece I did for Dissent, from prophecy to prosperity, as a way in which to think about what happened with the African-American community. And in that talk, in that writing, I talk about how things changed post-civil rights movement. What ended up happening was two things. One is that you had spaces open for African Americans to go into bigger places in political leadership as mayors, state governments, national government in terms of the Congress. And because of that, there was this sort of move away from pushing forward about the kinds of civil rights, because in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King, with the ascension of President Nixon in '68, and this sort of focus in on the war rather than integration and civil rights, because it was seen as a solved problem, these alliances broke apart. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think that's really important to understand about what is happening in the African American community that helps to contribute to this divide that begins to happen is the breakdown, or what I would call the erosion of the kinds of institutions that have been in the African American community. And what I mean by that is simply this: the NAACP, the Urban League, all kinds of women organizations and others begin to become less important in the communities in the 1970s and beyond. Where the NAACP before was looked as a powerhouse, the Urban League, other kinds of interfaith cooperations, all of those things began to sort of dwindle in importance in the community because of political clout. And because of that, these historic alliances that were made did not last in the same kinds of ways that they needed to last. And so I think it's really important to start to think about the strength of Jewish organizations that, like Defense League and others, where you had AIPAC, where you had all sorts of things that were there to push together the community. African Americans started to lose the power in those kinds of structures in the African American community. And so what happens is you get a breaking apart of the relationships that happen. I think the third thing, and I think this is really important, is the ways in which African American religion begins to change. Denominationalism is not the same. In the 1970s forward, you get to see a rise from Baptists into Pentecostal movements and others, and these kinds of evangelical movements within African American churches and American Christian life moves everything. Then you have a very, very big problem that is always the thing that I say is where I like to put it, this is where people put their foot in it really bad. And so I'm going to talk about it because I think this is a big piece of the problems that have happened, is Louis Farrakhan and Jesse Jackson. And we all know about the historical kinds of ways in which Louis Farrakhan's leadership of the Nation of Islam has been problematic, both for African Americans in terms of their thinking about his responsibility or non-responsibility of the assassination of Malcolm X, but even more so about his animus towards the Jewish community. And I think that this was an important piece in the breaking apart of this relationship, because I think for African American leaders, they felt as though they could not speak about him, and still to this day don't speak about him in ways in which that would vilify him or vilify these kinds of statements that he would make. And so I think that's a big piece. I don't have to bring you back if some of you remember Jesse Jackson's derogatory comments during his run for president about American Jews, and I will not use that terminology here, but that was also a moment in which things really blew up, I think, between African American communities and Jewish communities. And I think also where this is something that I would say is a really important thing, the issue of African Americans and anti-Semitism. I'll talk a little bit about this towards the end to put this in the context of Black Lives Matter and others in the recent killings that have happened in the Hasidic community and in Jersey at the deli. when this happened from these Black Hebrew Israelites. And there are some problems within this. And I think these kinds of religious issues stand out as a way to me to be breaking apart. But the other piece of this that I think people have not talked about very much is the change that happened in the American Jewish community. Because of the alliances that needed to be made, some of this happens because of bigger alliances with evangelicals. And I think that's a big piece of this. And I'm happy to talk about this in the comments. But I want to close out by just showing you a couple more things really quickly on the slides so that you get a sense of where we are now. And I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. One of the reasons why this is important to me now, because anti-Semitic incidents have been going up in the United States. We all know this. We can talk about what has happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue, what has happened with Jewish cemeteries being desecrated, all kinds of things that have been, happening in the nation all of this time, but especially within the last 5 to 6 years. And you can see the uptick from 2015 to 2018 of about assaults, harassment, vandalism, and others. Clearly, we have an issue. At the same time, we have an issue in terms of Black Lives Matter and police killings of African Americans. And I think that these two things are not dissimilar and not unrelated because of what is happening in our communities. And so with this year, when we saw what happened with George Floyd and others, but first let me get to Tree of Life. This is a picture of the Tree of Life Synagogue members and New Light congregation in Pittsburgh, standing together with the members of the Emmanuel AME Church on January 20th, 2019 in Charleston. These kinds of comings together because of the violence that is happening in our religious communities is a really important moment. And I think that it is, it broke my heart actually when Tree of Life Synagogue happened, because I realized that this was just a sort of a continuation of what had happened at Emmanuel AME Church back in 2015. And this rise of anti-Semitism, racist kinds of screeds, white supremacy, actually imperils both of our communities. And now is the time to bring this interfaith coalition, interreligious coalition back together. These kinds of events are hugely important for that. And then the last thing I want to talk about very quickly, because we're running out of time and I'll answer some more questions through this, is the push for Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, I know in a lot of the Jewish communities as well as other communities, has been problematic. It's problematic for the African-American religious community in lots of ways. But I think what we're beginning to see, especially in 2020, is a re-putting together of an alliance. You see this picture on the left-hand side from this June 2020 at 3rd and Fairfax, which is a big intersection for all of you here who know Los Angeles and the Jewish community there. I lived there for a long time, so I know it well. Jews for Black Lives is an important piece of all of this, and I'm starting to see the signs. I would like to show my Jews for Black Lives Matter Hebrew t-shirt, but I didn't have it out and it wasn't washed today because I work out in it, unfortunately. And then finally, this group of Orthodox Jewish people who held a rally and march in solidarity with Black Lives Matter on June 7th, 2020 in Crown Heights. This is really important because, as you know, if you have any history, if you're a little bit older as I am, you probably will remember what happened between African Americans and Jews in Crown Heights in 1991 with the violence and the pushback and the really terrible relationship between the African American community and the Hasidic community. So what am I saying here? What is the upshot of this talk? This is now a terrible time, but it's also an important time. It's a time in which we can begin to reestablish these connections that we've always had between our communities to fight things. One of the things that I've said before in front of synagogues and others is that if we put Israel in the middle of everything right now, it's going to always be a problem. The real problem is where we live right now in America. I understand that there's all kinds of questions to ask about BDS and all of those other things. What I want to focus on and what I think is important to all of us living in America right now, both American Jews and African American people alike, is the fact that our communities are being threatened by white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and people are dying because of these things. And we need to figure out a way to talk about this, first of all, and secondarily, to reestablish alliances between our communities so that we are able to fight against the perils that are coming at us from the outside. And I hope that once we can move into the next year and beyond, that we can begin to think about the ways in which we can partner together, not only to share our history together, but to share where we'll go forward together in terms of finding a better way and a better life for all of us. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Butler. Thank you very much. So I want to remind everybody that if you want to ask a question, the way to do so is to submit a question in writing through the Q&A feature. And now we're being joined by Dr. Ann Albert, who's going to read through the questions and call them together. And while she's doing that, let me just ask you a question, if that's okay, which is, you know, the flashpoint, and you alluded to this, but I was just hoping you would reflect a little bit more. You know, the single most visible flashpoint right now in the relationship between many Jews and many Blacks is Israel, and a sense of solidarity that many Blacks feel with Palestinians.
Yeah.
And that situation, whatever your political ideology, it's not going to be resolved anytime soon.
No.
So I guess my question is, how do you, is that impasse that cannot be gotten beyond? And if it can be gotten beyond, how do people get beyond it?
You know, right now I think it's an impasse that is a stumbling block. And I'm not saying that because I don't think that it can't be. I just think that it impedes the conversation. And I think this is on both sides, obviously. I kind of alluded to it at the beginning. I said both of the nationalistic tendencies of both, you know, Jews and African Americans for the kinds of things that we're thinking about come to a head when you think about the nation of Israel, okay? And so, you know, this is where I'm going to reveal myself and shock people in the chat who may think ill of me or whatever. But when I first came to Penn, and you and I have had a little conversation about this, I actually went to Israel with AIPAC because I went on the first big Black trip that they took. This was post the election of Obama in July of 2009. And it was a raucous trip because lots of us had questions. But I'm glad I did it for this reason. It was really interesting to see the kinds of polarization that was happening on the trip, first of all. And then secondarily, the questions that hadn't been thought of by the people who were taking us on the trip, because they didn't realize the kinds of, you know, when you talk about settlements, when you talk about all this stuff, they didn't realize the triggers that it would bring up about African-American history, right? And the history of Black people having land taken from them in America. So it's a tough talk, but I think that it's really difficult to have this conversation in the face of the kinds of existential threats that we have in America right now. And so what I'm saying is like, this is conversation that needs to be had, but if we have that conversation over the expense of trying to deal with what's happening to people right now, what's happening to the Jewish community in America, what's happening to African Americans in America right now, we miss the point, and we miss a space where we can actually begin to have a relationship together to fight for some similar things. And then we can get to this other thing to talk about, right? But until we deal with where we live right now, there's not any help, because basically the kinds of arguments that are used over here about Israel are going to be the same things that break us up over here. And this is a time that we really, and I cannot stress this enough, because of the uptick in violence and the kinds of things that are happening, that we really need to come together to try to think about solutions here.
All right, so we have already a ton of questions. The questions are rolling in, so my job is really challenging this evening. First of all, I want to apologize in advance for the people who won't necessarily get their questions answered. Hopefully you'll enjoy the ones that do. I want to start with a question posed by an audience member named Richard, who asks whether you think that the growing disaffiliation or disconnection of both Jews and African Americans from organized religion or religious communities has a negative effect on the potential to bring the two communities together.
That's actually a really good question. So thank you, Richard, for asking it. I think that the rise of, what we would call nuns, or maybe people who are unaffiliated or don't want to affiliate, whether Black or Jews, or they see this as a sort of a cultural appellation rather than a religious one. I think there's still room there for alliance. And the reason why I say that is because they're unencumbered from the sort of kinds of traditional roles that religion plays in this. You know, you don't, you think about the pictures I was showing from the civil rights movement. You have a lot of rabbis, but you had Jews who were participating in freedom rides, and young women and men and everybody else, right? So that was like this moment of the grassroots kind of groundswell. And I see that in Black Lives Matter too. And I think that's the reason why you could have a lot of Orthodox out there. There was an Orthodox rabbi who came and also supported that rally that I showed the picture from. But it also helps people to, sort of not have to do this top down kind of thing, but to find ways to be together. So I'm thinking about, magazines like The Forward and others, where people have been trying to draw, together. Social media helps with that too. I think we discount the ways in which social media brings people together in a different kind of way than these kinds of interfaith coalitions that happened in the 50s and 60s and beyond. So that's a really good question. I think there's definitely possibilities there. If we get back on college campuses sooner, that could happen as well. So I think, yes, I think there's possibilities, but it has to be worked on in a certain kind of way.
Thank you. So I think the flip side of that question is one that comes from someone named Allison, who's asking, if you have any advice or suggestions for synagogues who would like to build alliances with the African-American community, what kinds of programs and relationships are helpful? Basically, where do we start? And then connected with that, I'll just throw in that another person was asking about a local organization here in Philadelphia called Power.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up Power because I thought, Power is like a good space that happens in, right? Because I know people that belong to Power and I have kind of a relationship with them, even though I'm not clergy. I think that's a good space. I think, it's right now is really difficult, but actually it presents interesting possibilities because you're not having to go to somebody's church. You don't have to go to the synagogue. You can reach out to particular religious leaders in your area where you are and say, can we get together and have a conversation on Zoom? Can we even have even if you wanted to say, let's have a conversation about scripture. If you want to just talk about Exodus or something, do that. Have a way to begin. And there's obvious ways to tap into this. One way I say is always holidays, right? So we've got Hanukkah's coming up, Kwanzaa's coming up, right? This is a kind of an interesting meeting point to be able to talk about things. Whether we talk about them in terms of Black History Month, Jewish History Month, all of those kinds of things. I think that's a way to do it. The other way to do it too, I think that's really interesting and useful is if you have day schools versus, Black Christian schools, this is another space to do that. Now, here's my caution, and this is the big caution. You have to always be careful about the churches who want to evangelize you, okay? And when I say that, this one of the things that I didn't bring up in this talk, but I think is very disturbing, that really I think happened on the Jewish side for why this separation happens is because evangelicals really courted Jewish life and Jews in the 70s and beyond because of their own interest in how they wanted people to vote, how they thought that, everybody should become Christian so that the Messiah could come. All of those stories, right? And so when I was in Israel, this was one of the questions that I asked them, like, why are you always taking money from evangelicals? They don't really mean well by you. They don't want you to be Jewish. And they're like, well, because it's a relationship that helps protect us. And so we have to think about the relationships that we have and how to reach out to others that might not have the resources that you need for protection, but they do have voices in the community and they have power. So I would consider looking at organizations like Power, whatever you can find in your own community, where clergy are meeting and try to reach out to some of these African-American leaders before a murder happens, before the police come out, before everybody starts tearing up stuff, and try to have those conversations, because I guarantee you that those clergy members are as invested as you are in things not going awry in your community.
Great. Yeah, and the issue of connecting with Christian groups that might be evangelizing, has that dimension that some Jews have followed that path intentionally. And then there's also a sensitivity for sure on the part of Jews and Jewish communities about engaging in relationships that might have that ulterior motive. So
yeah. And I think it's important to just say that up front, is like, we're not here for that. We're here for some other stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, there are a few questions that are appealing to the historian of American religion and the historian of these affairs. So I'm going to ask a few of those in a cluster. The first one comes from Elise, who's asking about Black-Jewish relations within the South itself during the civil rights struggle, because it seems, at least from the way we hear about it and even the way that you talked about in the presentation, that most of the Jewish activism at the time was imported from the North. So what was going on within the South?
Well, that's a good question, because part of what's happening is kind of twofold. One is, there's a sense in which Jews are having problems because they're getting scrutiny from whites. So if you look at something like the White Citizens Council newspapers, they're talking about Jews just as much as they are African Americans, maybe a little bit less. But they're also wondering, like, who are these people? What are they doing in our community? Are they trying to be like us? Do we want to, there's the questions about their strangeness. And I'm using that word in terms of the way they think about it, not the way I'm describing it, okay? So there's that. For some Jews, there's an issue of, we think that this should be gradualism. And by gradualism, what I mean is like, it's good that, things are happening, but people shouldn't be marching, people shouldn't be sitting at counters, blah, 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 et cetera. There's a sense in which part of the community wants to be able to blend in and to be able to not feel so alienated from this white Protestant kind of world that is happening. And so they also know that they're being, scrutinized too and being discriminated against. And then there's a third piece is kind of this interesting piece about how do, shop owners and everybody else kind of deal with the kinds of things that are happening when the boycotts happen, because that's really important, because they're getting hit in ways that they don't want to be hit, because, they're like, well, we're not doing this to you. We're trying to, we're trying to be nice, but their businesses are suffering. So there's a lot of different things that are happening on the ground that are, important. But obviously you can see with these synagogue bombings that they consider Jews to be just the same thing as Black people, and that they don't like Jews either. And so all of this is of a piece about, how are you supposed to behave? And so there's a sense in which in these communities that not everybody is like a monolith in terms of dealing with this, especially in the South. And there's a couple of books that I can send along to Professor Weinzman to put that up if y'all want to put something up afterwards and direct people to read that, because there's some really good books about this out.
Yeah, absolutely. We usually send a follow-up so we can include any suggestions that you might have. So a kind of follow-up to that question is about the aftermath of all of that. And I think you touched on it a little bit in what you said. Sarah asks if part of the wedge that was driven between African Americans and Jews after the murder of MLK was that Jews were gradually becoming more politically white, in other words, more aligned with whiteness.
Some of that is true, yes. I mean, that they're more politically aligned with whiteness. I mean, I would say more, economically aligned with whiteness too. And then part of it is also about, our own communities. What I said about the breakdown in terms of certain things like the Urban League and the NAACP, even though it existed, dropping back in terms of participation, you didn't lose that in, the JCC and other organizations. Your organizations remained strong, and they remained strong in the communities. And, people went to day schools, you did all that, the rise in economic, growth and wealth and all of these other things put everybody in kind of a different space. And so I think what happens in the 70s in terms of that is a sense in which there's a mainstreaming of American Judaism in a different kind of way that is happening then with African American religion, because it kind of, African American religion makes this kind of interesting turn into this prosperity kind of thing and changes, and also gets a little bit co-opted by evangelicals. But for American Jews, where you go is either to a very secular kind of spot, right? Or you're in a very religious kind of spot in which, your communities and the kinds of associations and things that you already have really are the backbone of the community, and they don't break. And I think, in a lot of ways that's good. And I wish that had happened in the African-American community.
Okay, so just one more of these kind of history questions about the title, What Went Wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This is a more specific one, but I wonder if you have some way of speaking to it. So Alana says that, she says the following: I've read accounts from Jewish women who had been active members of SNCC and participated in the freedom rides or Freedom Summer or voter registration drives, and they expressed real heartbreak at what they felt as being pushed out of SNCC by the mid 60s. And they still seem really bewildered about what happened there. And so she wonders if you have any take on what that breakdown was.
Yeah, she's talking about Student Nonviolent Coordination Commission, or SNCC, right? One of the things that happened with SNCC is that SNCC got a lot more radical. And this is not just a break about them, but it's a break that happens in the movement because they really disagree with Martin Luther King in terms of how this is happening. And one way to kind of process this is going to sound strange, but it makes a lot of sense, is what happens with John Lewis and who becomes the leader of SNCC. It's not John Lewis. I'm losing my names right now because it's like when you have all this history in your head, sometimes you forget names. But it really is a moment in which how SNCC changes. And so that disillusionment that they felt is about this change that's happening sort of above them in a way, but it also is a change about how SNCC is thinking about, oh, we don't need all these people. We want to make this all Black. We want to make this more radical. We don't want to be nonviolent anymore. And so this ends up really alienating a lot of people who were very sincere to come down and be a part of the movement. And I think you caught on to that in the reading about how disillusioned and how sad they feel. And I think that's a real issue. I just actually had my students reading, and I'm going to forget the letter and the title, a letter about a romance that happens between one of the Jewish volunteers and an African-American man, and how things sort of break up in the midst of that. And as my old advisor used to say, the one thing we can't talk about, in the civil rights movement is the relationships that people have that, we think that are not happening, but they're happening. And so I think some of that disillusionment comes from how women are being treated, especially how people are thinking about how they want to be more, in your face and not nonviolent anymore. And that creates a big fissure.
That makes sense. There's again, I think following up on one of the things you've said, there are a few questions being asked about intersectionality, partly in connection with the issue of Israel, but also in connection even with the clip of Joachim Prince that you played.
Mm-hmm.
Because, he makes this statement that Jews do feel and ought to feel total identification with American Black experience. And that's the kind of remark that might not play very well today. So
it probably wouldn't. That's what I was thinking. I was like, you can tell it's 1963 and not 2020, right? Because today, I don't think that would play the same way. But I think, the intersectionality, it's not just about, the relationship about slavery. I think that's actually a really difficult one, I feel like, in a lot of ways for people to embrace, because African Americans don't really want to talk about slavery in certain kinds of ways. So we have to acknowledge that too. But I do think that this is a moment where the violence that is happening to both of our communities is a spot for that intersectionality. And even even and I mentioned this just a little bit with what happened with those with the Delhi murders in Jersey and what happened to the Hasidic rabbi. The groups that did that, these Black Jews who are not Black Jews, real Black Jews, but sort of like this offshoot organization where these people belong to. This is part of an anti-Semitic kind of trope that has happened, and for in some African-American religious groups. And I think we have to talk about that and really push back against that just as much as we do white anti-Semitism. And I think to me, that's a personal miss for a lot of African-American religious leaders, that they do not address this. I was personally disappointed by the ways in which people did not pick up on this when those murders happened, because I could see that very clearly. And I had some thoughts about what probably was happening interiorly to that group that were changing it. I can't prove it, but I think that there's some change in leadership that has brought this kind of rhetoric in, because they've never had it before. And so I think that one of the things that this intersectionality in 2020 that could happen needs to be about, stomping out anti-Semitism on both sides, first of all, working against that, but also to work against the kind of the racialized violence that's happening to African Americans, whether that is, promoted by the police or by white people as well.
Yeah, it's much more complicated when it's not just two oppressed people fighting together against something else, but when they start fighting each other and perceiving each other as having those animosities. Okay, so we're coming very close to the end. We're supposed to wrap up in a few minutes. There are a few questions that I want to sort of cluster together that are about generational difference in how these things are perceived and understood and educated about. One is an education question and one is an institutional question.
Okay.
So the educational one is Dean comments that the history review that you provided was a good backdrop to explain the similarities between the African-American experience and the Jewish experience. But I fear that today's youth may not have the historical context to understand why coordinating with the Jewish community again, like in the 60s, is important. So how can that education happen at scale? How can the word get out that such a thing is?
You got to be involved in the public school education that is happening right now, which is just awful. Today, the University of Pennsylvania announced that they were given $10 million a year for 10 years to the school district here in town, because they were hoping that this would help, repair things. But part of this is about, what the curriculum looks like and how people are being taught about the civil rights movement. I will tell you that I teach at Penn, which is an Ivy League institution, and I get so many students who don't know half of anything about the civil rights movement. They don't know these relationships. They're not being taught that either in public school or private school or day school or anywhere, okay? And nobody talks about this. And so when I get to it, they're all like, really? I didn't know, So I think that's something very important that we have to think about, is how to change that education. I wish people would start writing more books about this, especially children's books. I think that's a good way to get at, kids from a very early age, to start to teach them about, these historic kinds of relationships and what could happen. And the other thing is that there's a lot of good video out there right now in terms of thinking about people in the movement. I think there's a movie about Rabbi Prince that just came out not too long ago. And there's some other things that, talk about this relationship between the two communities. And so I think that kind of education, if you got grandkids, kids, somebody, having them watch this stuff is really important. It's incumbent not just upon educators, but about people at home. When you're doing that at JCC or you're doing something for Black History Month or something, that's the moment to bring all these things together and to talk about them. And I think, I think about things like birthright and others. I would love somebody to come up and do a program, like a birthright program here in the US that went through like civil rights movement and put, Black kids and Jewish kids together and say, we want you to walk the same walk about racism, and to talk about that from both a present day perspective and a historical perspective. I would love it if somebody would fund something like that, because I think that would be like an excellent thing to do in terms of teaching.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I do think there's almost a sense on the part of older generations that everybody knows that this was part of the civil rights movement, and even that maybe it's more complicated than that, so we shouldn't tell a simple story, but then things get lost, right?
Yeah, and I felt like tonight, I couldn't get into a complicated story because we have time, right? I could do a whole semester on a class like this. But I think that, for older generations of people, both African Americans and Jews alike, we have to talk about this stuff, right? I mean, to talk about these relationships and where they are painful, where they are life-giving, where they are affirming. You have to talk about these relationships, because I think they're really, very important in terms of thinking about how do we go forward and what are the kinds of challenges we're facing in our communities.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the institutional organizational question that's connected, although we are past our time already. But Adam asks if there is any role for organizations in both communities that have maintained this kind of alliance at an institutional level, like the NAACP, the Urban League, the ADL, labor unions, other civil rights groups. So is there a way to use that institutional framework that already exists? Or does that kind of organization really just not speak to millennials and Gen Z, and there's something else that's needed?
I think there's ways to get those organizations to speak to Gen Z and millennials and things like that. I just think that the way in which they do it, they have to be in the places where they are. And right now, I don't see, the NAACP is like non-existent to me on Twitter or Facebook or any of these other places. I mean, I'm a Twitter person, so I'm just thinking about how do you get to people right now? Are you doing TikTok? Are you doing, all these other things? And that's not happening. I mean, but I'm actually, this is going to sound really funny. I'm actually very interested in how the Biden administration is going to pull all these things together, because I think this is actually kind of an interesting moment where he had really good, interesting stuff happening during the campaign that was sort of under the radar screen for everybody in terms of TikTok and all of that, and how people were using it. But then he had those traditional kinds of relationships between the NAACP, unionized organizations, you know, ADL, others. And I think that this might be a moment that's a bridge. And maybe I'm just overly hopeful because everything is so bad that I can do nothing but hope. But I do think there's an opportunity here because of everything that we've gone through in the last 4 years and how things have really been, you know, troubled in this country, that we have a moment in which people are going to have to get together, because that's the only way we're going to repair any of this. Any of it gets repaired unless people work together.
That is an amazing, hopeful note to
Yeah.
end on. It looks like Steve has joined us again and wants to probably thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to add my thanks to Professor Butler for, you know, both the elucidation and also for a sense of hope in the future, which we do all need indeed. I also want to thank the audience for your engagement today, and if you've attended previous talks in the series, for that as well. And I just want to let everybody know that we're going to dig deeper into this topic next semester. We're going to have another online series starting in January on Jews, race, and religion. And it's going to give us an opportunity to kind of build on the foundation that Professor Butler has laid here and explore all kinds of questions and issues that bear on the intersection of Jewishness, race, and religion in America and elsewhere. It's going to feature 10 guest lectures with scholars from everywhere from Princeton to Morocco. So I hope you can join us for that. You just check out our website in January. And I want to, you know, express my gratitude again to Professor Butler, to the Katz Center staff, and to all of you. And I wish you all good night. Thank you.